What would you do if Kirk Douglas showed up at your father's funeral, a man he hadn't seen in 20 years, and gave a speech that made an entire town weep? That's exactly what happened in a small Texas cemetery on February 11th, 1967. And 55 years later, the gravedigger's son revealed why that one afternoon changed how an entire town thought about loyalty, fame, and what it really means to show up. It was a cold Thursday morning in Barstow, Texas, population 2,300. The kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where strangers stood out like tumbleweeds in a church, and where the biggest excitement in years had been when the diner got a new jukebox. Harold Gene Mitchell was about to be buried. He was 58 years old. He had no surviving family, no wife, no children. No brothers or sisters, just a small obituary in the local paper that said he had worked in Hollywood as a stuntman for 30 years before retiring to Texas. The funeral was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at Peaceful Valley Cemetery. Reverend Thomas Callahan had prepared a short service. Bobby Martinez and his son Danny, the town's gravediggers, had dug the hole the night before. Everything was ready, but nobody was coming. Reverend Callahan stood at the gravesite, checking his watch. It was 1:45. The wind was blowing hard, kicking up dust across the empty cemetery. Bobby Martinez leaned on his shovel and shook his head. "Sad thing," Bobby said to his son. "Man spends his whole life working, and nobody shows up to say goodbye." Danny Martinez was 19 years old. He had been helping his father dig graves since he was 14. He had seen a lot of funerals, big ones with hundreds of people, small ones with just a widow and a priest. But he had never seen a funeral where absolutely nobody came. "Maybe someone will show up," Danny said. "There's still time." Bobby shrugged. "Maybe, but I doubt it. Man had no family. Lived alone in that little house on Miller Road for 15 years. Kept to himself. Nobody really knew him." At 1:55, a car appeared on the horizon. It was a rental, a black sedan that looked out of place on the dusty Texas roads. The car pulled up to the cemetery gate and stopped. A man got out. He was wearing an expensive dark overcoat. His hair was gray at the temples, but still thick. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, with a famous cleft chin that Danny had seen somewhere before, but couldn't quite place. The man walked through the cemetery gate and headed straight for the gravesite. His steps were purposeful. His expression was serious. Reverend Callahan looked up, surprised. "Can I help you, sir?" The man stopped at the edge of the grave. He looked at the coffin, then at the Reverend, then at Bobby and Danny Martinez. "I'm here for Harold Mitchell's funeral," the man said. Reverend Callahan blinked. "You knew Harold?" "I knew him, a long time ago. He saved my life once." The Reverend's face softened. "Well, praise the Lord. I was afraid no one would come. I'm Reverend Thomas Callahan. And you are?" The man extended his hand. "Kirk Douglas." Danny Martinez's shovel hit the ground. Bobby's jaw dropped. Reverend Callahan nearly fell over. Kirk Douglas. The movie star, Spartacus, Champion, The Vikings. One of the most famous actors in the world was standing in their tiny cemetery in Barstow, Texas. "Mr. Douglas," Reverend Callahan stammered. Why are you here?" Kirk looked at the coffin. "Because Harold Mitchell deserves to have someone at his funeral, and because I owe him more than I can ever repay." He turned to the Reverend. "Before you start the service, I'd like to say a few words, if that's all right." Of course, please." Kirk Douglas walked to the head of the grave. He stood there for a moment, looking at the cheap wooden coffin, the empty cemetery, the gray Texas sky. Then he began to speak. "My name is Kirk Douglas. I'm an actor. I make movies. But I'm not here today as an actor." I'm here as a man who owes a debt that took me 20 years to repay." His voice carried across the silent cemetery. In 1947, I was a young actor, hungry, desperate, convinced I was invincible. I was working on a Western, and there was a stunt, a fall from a horse that the director wanted me to do myself. Kirk paused. Harold Mitchell was the stuntman on that picture. He pulled me aside and said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Listen, kid, being brave doesn't mean being stupid. This is my job. Let me do it." Kirk's jaw tightened. I argued with him. I wanted to prove myself. But Harold insisted. He did the stunt, and something went wrong. The horse stumbled. Harold hit the ground wrong. He broke 3 ribs and fractured his collarbone. Danny Martinez was frozen, listening to every word. When I ran over to him, horrified at what had happened, Harold looked up at me from the dirt and smiled. He said, "See, kid, that could have been you. Now you can keep making movies. Me, I'll heal up and do it again next month. That's the deal." Kirk's voice cracked slightly. "That's the deal." Those 3 words changed my life. Harold Mitchell took that fall so I wouldn't have to. He broke his bones so I could keep my career, and I never forgot it. Kirk reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, an old silver dollar, worn smooth from years of handling. Harold gave me this coin on the last day of that picture. He said it was his lucky coin, said it had gotten him through 100 falls. He told me to keep it, to remember that luck isn't just what happens to you. It's the people who look out for you. Kirk placed the coin on top of the coffin. "I've carried this coin for 20 years. It's been with me through every film I've ever made, every award, every success, and now I'm giving it back to you, Harold." He stepped back. Hollywood doesn't remember the Harold Mitchells of the world. We remember the stars. We put their names on posters and their faces on magazine covers. But we forget the men who made it possible, the men who bled so we could pretend to bleed, the men who fell so we could pretend to fall. Kirk looked at the small group gathered around the grave. Harold Gene Mitchell died alone. No family, no friends at his bedside. But he's not going to be buried alone. I'm here, Harold, and I'm going to make sure someone remembers you. Kirk turned to the coffin one last time. "Goodbye, old friend. Thank you for the fall. Thank you for the deal. Thank you for everything." Reverend Callahan wiped his eyes and began the formal service. It was brief. When it was over, Bobby and Danny Martinez lowered the coffin into the ground. Kirk Douglas stayed until the last shovel of dirt was placed on the grave. Then he knelt down, placed his hand on the fresh earth, and whispered something that nobody else could hear. Before Kirk left, he walked over to Bobby Martinez and shook his hand. "Thank you for giving him a proper burial," Kirk said. Bobby could barely speak. "Mr. Douglas, what you did here today, I've been digging graves for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." Kirk shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. I just showed up. That's all any of us can do. Show up when it matters." He shook Danny's hand too, looking the young man in the eyes. "Remember this, son. Fame doesn't mean anything. Money doesn't mean anything. The only thing that matters is whether you show up for the people who showed up for you." Then Kirk Douglas got in his rental car and drove away, disappearing down the dusty Texas road. The story of what happened that day spread through Barstow like wildfire. Martha Henderson at the motel told everyone that Kirk Douglas had checked in the night before. She said he was polite, quiet, and had asked for directions to the cemetery. Reverend Callahan mentioned it in his Sunday sermon. He said it was the most moving funeral he had ever conducted, and that Kirk Douglas had reminded him what true Christian charity looked like. Bobby Martinez told the story at the diner so many times that people started coming from other towns just to hear it. But it was Danny Martinez who was most affected by what he witnessed that day. 55 years later, in 2022, Danny Martinez was 74 years old. He had taken over his father's business and had been the gravedigger in Barstow for over 5 decades. He had buried hundreds of people, but he never forgot the afternoon Kirk Douglas came to town. When a journalist tracked him down to ask about that day, Danny sat on his porch and told the story from beginning to end. His eyes were wet by the time he finished. "I was 19 years old," Danny said. "I thought I knew what life was about. I thought famous people were different from us, that they lived in a world we couldn't touch." He shook his head, but Kirk Douglas drove 90 miles to stand at the grave of a man nobody remembered. "He gave a speech that made my father cry, and my father never cried. He put his lucky coin in the ground with a man who had been forgotten by the whole world." Danny paused. "That changed me. After that day, I made a promise to myself. I promised that nobody I buried would ever be buried alone. If there was no family, I would stand at the grave myself. I would say a few words. I would make sure somebody remembered them." The journalist asked how many times Danny had done that over the years. Danny smiled. 412 times. "I kept count. Every single person who had nobody, I stood there for them. Because Kirk Douglas taught me, that's what you do. You show up." The journalist asked if Danny had ever tried to contact Kirk Douglas to tell him about the impact he had made. Danny nodded. "I wrote him a letter in 1989, told him the whole story, told him what his visit meant to me and my father, told him about my promise. What did he write back?" Danny reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. He wrote back 3 words. "That's the deal." Danny held up the letter. "That's the deal. Same thing Harold Mitchell said to him 40 years earlier. That's how Kirk Douglas saw the world. You do something good for someone, and they pass it on. That's the deal." When Kirk Douglas died on February 5, 2020, Danny Martinez drove 12 hours to Los Angeles. He was 72 years old. He had never left Texas before, except once, to visit his daughter in New Mexico. He stood at the back of the crowd at Kirk's memorial service. He didn't try to speak to the family. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to be there. After the service, when the crowds had left, Danny walked to Kirk's grave. He knelt down and placed something on the fresh earth. A single Texas wildflower. "You showed up for Harold," Danny whispered. "So I showed up for you. That's the deal." Then he stood up, wiped his eyes, and drove 12 hours back to Texas. The story of Kirk Douglas and the funeral in Barstow has been told many times over the years. Some details have changed, some have been exaggerated, but the core of the story remains true. A movie star flew across the country to attend the funeral of a man nobody remembered. He stood at a grave in an empty cemetery and gave a speech about loyalty, gratitude, and the importance of showing up. And a 19-year-old gravedigger watched it happen and decided to spend the rest of his life doing the same thing. 412 funerals, 412 people who would have been buried alone. 412 times Danny Martinez stood at a grave and said, "You mattered. Someone remembers." That's the legacy of Kirk Douglas. Not the films, not the awards, not the fame. The legacy is Danny Martinez and the 412 graves he stood over because a movie star taught him what it means to show up. The man who never bent, the man who never forgot. And the deal that passed from Harold Mitchell to Kirk Douglas to Danny Martinez and will keep passing on for as long as people remember this story. Because that's the deal. You show up for the people who showed up for you, and then you pass it on.